Chapter 12. Communism. Society beyond the commodity, money, and the state. Marx's political aim was to overcome capitalism. A socialist or communist society. Marx and Engels used the terms interchangeably in the 1860s, in which private property in the means of production is abolished and production is therefore no longer carried out with the goal of profit maximization, was to take capitalism's place. Marx did not draft an extensive concept for such a society, so that even today many readers of Capital are surprised when they find out that it does not contain even a small chapter about communism. However, at various points, both in Capital as well as in earlier writings, Marx attempted to draw conclusions from his analysis of capitalism concerning general determinations of communism. Since such conclusions depend upon the respective level of analysis, there are widely varying pronouncements that do not, however, add up to a unified conception. There are two widespread complexes of conceptions regarding what constitutes communism in Marx's sense. However, neither has much to do with the critique of political economy outlined in the preceding chapters. Communism as an ideal. Here it is assumed that communism means a society as it should be, for ethical reasons. People should not exploit and oppress other people. They should not seek to gain material advantage, but rather show solidarity and helpfulness, etc. In Marx's early writings, one finds a few pronouncements that can be interpreted in this direction. Against such a conception, it is often objected that humans are not as good as communism requires, but that they always seek personal advantage and that communism therefore cannot function. On the other hand, people who are ethically or religiously motivated find a point of contact here, since Marx's ostensible ethics seem to be strongly compatible with Christian ethics, for example. Both sides do not consider the fact that in Capital, Marx does not criticize capitalism for moral reasons. Rather, in the course of his analysis, he demonstrates that moral conceptions are socially produced. It thus follows that morals only exist as the morals of a particular society, but not as a universal morality one can measure individual societies against. Capitalism as the nationalization of the means of Communism as the nationalization of the means of production. The abolition of private property in the means of production is here equated with nationalization and state planning of the economy. Against this, the objection is raised that state planning is far too cumbersome and slow and includes a tendency towards authoritarian rule. Often the, quote, really existing socialism of the Soviet Union is regarded as a more or less direct implementation of this conception of communism. The collapse of the Soviet Union is often taken as an obvious proof of the inevitable failure of communism. One finds demands for the nationalization of production both in the Communist Manifesto as well as in Engels' Anti-Düring, but only as a first measure and never as a characterization of communism. Rather, the means of production should pass into the hands of society, and the state ultimately dies out. In the few fundamental observations concerning communism that Marx makes on the basis of the critique of political economy, two things are clear. First, the communist society is no longer based upon exchange. Both the expenditure of labor power in production as well as the distribution of products, first in their use as means of production and subsistence, then as the distribution of consumption goods among the individual members of society, occur in a manner consciously and methodically regulated by society, not by the market or the state. Not only capital, self-valorizing value, but also the commodity and money no longer exist. Second, Marx is not only concerned with the distribution that is quantitatively different from that under capitalism. This question of distribution was emphasized in traditional Marxism, but primarily with the emancipation from a social nexus that takes on a life of its own and imposes itself upon individuals as an anonymous compulsion. Not only the capital relation as a specific relation of exploitation that generates bad and insecure working and living conditions for the majority of the population should be overcome. The fetishism that attaches to the products of labor as soon as they are produced as commodities should be abolished. Social emancipation, the liberation from self-produced and therefore gratuitous constraints, is only possible when the social relations that generate the various forms of fetishism have disappeared. Only then can the members of society truly regulate and organize their social affairs themselves as an association of free men. Marx is concerned with this comprehensive emancipation and not merely with the question of distribution. In contrast, it was a central tenet of traditional worldview Marxism and Marxism-Leninism that socialism or communism would lead to another mode of distribution that would offer individuals a foundation for other and better possibilities for development. According to this distribution-centric conception, an authoritarian welfare state that retains certain structures of the market economy can be regarded as socialism or communism. The really existing socialism in Russia, Eastern Europe, and China moved exactly in this direction. The party elite occupied positions of state power and steered the economy in the direction of the greatest possible increase of material output, a somewhat egalitarian distribution of income, as well as the greatest possible social security. In the really existing socialist welfare state, the policies of the ruling party were not just imposed in an authoritarian manner against a political opposition striving for the reintroduction of capitalism. The majority of the population also had no actual influence. It was a more or less well taken care of, but a passive object of the party's policies. Open discussions could occur only in a very limited way, if at all. The ruling communist parties in the socialist countries, socialist in quotes, also did not allow their monopolies of power to be questioned by communist forces. Society here did not regulate the social process, the party did. Clear-sightedly, Rosa Luxemburg criticized such tendencies early on. In her uncompleted text, The Russian Revolution, she writes, quote, "Without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, becomes a mere semblance of life in which only bureaucracy remains as the active element. Public life gradually falls asleep. A few dozen party leaders of inexhaustible energy and balanced experience direct and rule. Among them, in reality, only a dozen outstanding heads do the leading, and an elite of the working class is invited from time to meetings where they are to applaud the speeches of the leaders and to approve proposed resolutions unanimously. At bottom, then, a clique affair." End quote. That's from the Rosa Luxemburg Reader, Monthly Review Press, 2004. Sorry, Monthly Review Press. The state in really existing socialism was primarily an instrument for securing the party's rule over society. The dying out of the state was postponed to a distant future. However, for Marx's conception of communism, it is precisely this point that is of decisive importance. The state, whether bourgeois or socialist, constitutes an independent force standing above society that organizes to a certain extent and imposes, by force if necessary, a specific form of reproduction. Against this, the association of free men, Marx's characterization of communism, regulates its affairs without resort to such an external independent force. As long as such a force exists, one cannot speak of an association of free men. That one can only speak of communism when not only the commodity, money, and the capital have been abolished, but the state as well, does not mean that such a society would have no rules. The members of such a society would have to regulate their social life organize production in individual workplaces, coordinate between workplaces, harmonize their different interests as producers and consumers, find ways of dealing with minority positions, and for a long time will still have to deal with different forms of gender and racial discrimination. Such discrimination would not automatically disappear once capitalist exploitation ends. The enormous effort of coordination that a communist society would have to perform, coordination that occurs today through the market, should not be underestimated in any case, nor should differences of interest and conflicts, as well as the danger of coordinating instances taking on a life of their own and becoming a state structure. When Engels writes in Anti-Düring that, quote, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, end quote, this is correct, but one should also add that the administration of things also contains a potential for power that can always lead to the domination of people. Despite all these difficulties, there is still no immediately apparent argument as to why a communist society should be impossible in principle. However, communism, if it is not to be a crude communism that merely manages scarcity, is tied to a certain economic and social preconditions. Marx emphasizes the massive development of productivity on the basis of science and technology, as well as the comprehensive development of the abilities of the workers as essential preconditions for the transition to a communist society, even if both only occur in capitalism upon a narrow foundation limited by the goal of profit maximization. Two things are clear in connection with Marx's considerations. First, it is not sufficient for the transition to a communist society to conquer and defend state power during a weak phase of bourgeois rule, like in Russia in 1917. Without the corresponding social and economic preconditions, a socialist revolution might be successful as a project to maintain the power of a political party, but not as a project of social emancipation. Second, a communist society requires a particular development to transform the preconditions created within capitalism. Not until a higher phase of communist society, quote, where the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, can, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, end quote, apply. Even when a communist society can only be achieved with difficulty, in light of the social devastation wrought by global capitalism, by crises and unemployment in the developed countries, as well as in the countries of the so-called Third World, while there exists at the same time a historically unprecedented level of material wealth, in light of the destruction of the natural foundations of life caused by capitalist production, no longer occurring locally but affecting the planet as a whole, clearly visible in climate change, in light of constant wars that also emanate from or are promoted by democratic, quote, democratic bourgeois states, in light of all that, there are good enough reasons to abolish capitalism and replace it with a, quote, an association of free men, end quote.